Rome Open City is notable, first and foremost, for having been shot while Italy was still at war. Rome had been liberated, but the rest of the country hadn't even been liberated yet when this film was being made. They started writing it while the Nazis were still occupying Rome, and so you're really getting a look at the state of Rome right after World War II, or practically still during it. And the term open city refers to a settlement which has announced that it's abandoned all of its defensive efforts, generally in the event of the imminent capture of that city, to avoid destruction. And then once the city has declared its open status, then the opposing military is expected under international law to be peaceful occupiers rather than just destroy the city. So that's where the title comes from. It deals with a number of different characters and incidents, mostly based on real incidents, different people involved in the resistance to the Nazi occupation towards the end of the war. I think it's set like maybe 9 months before the liberation of Rome, something like that.
Well, it's such a critical moment in the history of Rome, and it's a groundbreaking movie. It really is kind of a in many ways shocking film, especially given the fact that it's filmed in 1945. It is a very, very striking, hard look at what it's like to be a city that is occupied by hostile invaders. You feel very sort of trapped in those streets for the duration of the film. So I found it, I really wanted to have the opportunity to think about this and think about a film that's so raw, and as you were saying, filmed literally while the rest of the country is still at war, moments after the liberation of Rome, so that he still has, the bullets on the walls, the scraping, that authenticness of the set, which is the city itself. So I think also I was interested, or I am interested, or I'm particularly interested in seeing Rome in this moment, given the fact that I see this sort of beautiful, glamorous Rome every day. And it's a very remarkable reflection on how Rome has risen again after being really subjected to such horror and abnegation.
That was an impression that I got watching this film was, well, the title of the film is Rome, Open City. And so the city of Rome sort of figures very prominently into the film, but maybe not in a way that someone would expect. I feel like, especially today, I would expect, drone shots of St. Peter's or right. Any of the like sort of flashy signals that this is about the eternal city. And, we get a little bit of that at the beginning, where we get, a very beautiful Roman skyline. In fact, I think the film kind of bookends with such images, but throughout, what you get instead is a kind of neorealist flavor and experience of the city, especially this wartime look. So we're in these train yards or apartment complexes, or just on the street.
I heard somebody describe it as they demonumentalize Rome in the city, and I heard it suggested that this might be in part a reaction to the sort of the fascist approach of sort of a big focus on the great architecture and the monuments and all of this stuff, to sort of these awe-inspiring artifacts, whereas this is taking a much more sort of street level view of the city. I don't know if that was what Rossellini was thinking about, but it is sort of in contrast to the type of imagery. I wish I had actually seen some of the films that Rossellini had made earlier, because Rossellini was, and a number of the great Italian directors actually got their training sort of under the fascist regime, and then sort of quickly turned around as soon as they were able and started making films that were maybe more critical. Although although, well, we can get into it later. The villain of this film is less the fascists and more the Nazis.
It's clearly it's clearly not so much to create division among the Italians for their adherence to fascism. It's really to create a common enemy, which were the Germans who occupied the city. It's a very interesting thing to watch the movie with all this distance, to see the kind of the fascist part comes up here and there, but by now this story is not interested in the Italians who have been collaborating or part of the Benito Mussolini regime. It's very interested in these partigiani, these people who have been fighting, and really by glorifying them from all different sort of the ingegnere, from the woman to the priest to the guardian who sort of is kind of trying to work for them but isn't really working for the Nazis. I mean, it really is a story about that. I also think something interesting about the work is that while there is a sort of a mention of this imminent arrival of the liberators, so these generals, the people who sway the fate of nations, are on their way, there is absolutely no real focus on any of the major characters in World War II. So in this moment, we don't hear about Hitler, we don't hear about Pius XII, we don't hear about, well, Mussolini is dead at this point. We don't hear about, it's not a story of the great movers and shakers. And I think that's where Rossellini is really trying to tell a story, that when we read the history, we hear about, the general who is liberating and the generals of the occupiers, the great people who orchestrate the affairs of men. He's not interested in that. He's interested in these little human lives that that make up the actual building blocks of the resistance movement. And so we leave these exalted corridors and we go into the streets, and we see very much like a Caravaggio painting, a lot like the Caravaggio painting, the Acts of Mercy, how in the street, which is, a mean, rough place where they're fighting over bread and there's, everyone's trying to get by, we see this sort of extraordinary sort of light of goodness of people who are fighting for what is true.
But yeah, this character of Don Pietro is the like you said, this central drama emerges, James, and it's the main figures of which are or the main heroes of which I should say are really Don Pietro, and then this fellow who goes by a number of different names. Manfredi is, I think, the main name that he's referred to by. He's going under the name of Manfredi. He's this engineer. He turns out to be actually like a communist partisan who is resisting the Nazis. And so one of the big things in this film is this sort of unification and this alliance between two characters who would be normally opposed, namely a Catholic priest and a communist, where they're both, in a way, sort of, vying for a heroic death together, but it's very interesting because we're told by the priest that it is the priest's prayers that are keeping this guy, strong to the end, which is interesting. I mean, because there's a very clear, like in the scenes where Manfredi is being tortured at the end of the film, he's very clearly presented in this cruciform manner, and likened to Christ. And you could say, in the Catholic tradition, a martyr is one who dies, in odium fidei, like, or whatever the term is, like he's killed out of hatred for the faith, which is why some people who die for other heroic causes are not classified as martyrs by the church. But so you could ask, is somebody who's dying for the communist cause necessarily a martyr, even if it's heroic, whatever it is? But I think the fact that they have it said that the priest is sustaining him with his prayers, and there's kind of this solidarity that they have that also gives this spiritual meaning to Manfredi's death. I know we're sort of jumping right to the end there, but this pairing of these two characters, I think, is important also for the political themes of the film, which are really about, reunifying Italians. It was originally going to be an anti-fascist film, but his colleagues, a lot of them were communists, and Rossellini's colleagues, a lot of them were communists and partisans. And in the coalition government that was forming, even the communists decided that for the sake of peace, the fascists need to be integrated. And so the intro text to the film, it talks about the Nazi occupation, but not the fascist regime. And it becomes about Italian solidarity. At the end, we see that the Italian soldiers are reluctant to fire on a priest, and it's this Nazi who finally, fires the final shot that kills Don Pietro. The real Don Morosini, who this guy is based on, was executed by Italians. And that was originally scripted, but the coalition government insisted on changing it for the sake of unity. And it's just very interesting because Rossellini, just a few years ago, before, had made a film in which there's another priest who dies heroically serving as chaplain to Italian troops fighting in Russia. And the end titles of that film talk about the glory of fighting the godless communists. So it's just interesting to see this film as being, neorealist, but also kind of revisionist in a way, for the sake of national unity. And not only that, but because the film and many neorealist films portray the Italian people as essentially victims of the war, this film apparently went a long way, especially in America, towards sort of restoring friendly feelings towards Italy from the Allies. So it's interesting to see this as a neorealist work of art, but also in a sense, to some extent, as a work of propaganda. And I don't say that in a negative sense.
Sure.
But yeah.
Yeah, well, it's one thing that you sort of have to ask yourself, especially about a film that's made so quickly after the events that it depicts. It's, on the one hand, yeah, there is a kind of authenticity there because you're able to document a certain aspect to the city or sort of like character of the historical circumstances that you might lose with the passage of time. But then on the other hand, when these things are still so present and raw, there's like a certain objectivity that is not possible at that point,
I'm curious about this element of it's interesting because I didn't expect us to kind of hit on the propagandistic aspect of the film, and I don't know, I find it interesting that that's come up because when you consider the history of neorealism in general, but also the war trilogy, Rossellini's this film and the Paisa and Germany Year Zero, which followed on this, these were very important films for the filmmakers who would go on to be make the French New Wave. So much of which just that the kind of like post-war French film criticism context has a huge influence on the Vatican film list, as does the Italian context. But all these things were kind of going together in post-war Europe, where Christians and Christian artists are trying to figure out kind of what comes next, what do we do next. And it's interesting to me that what became known as neorealism was very inspirational for a lot of these types. Because they felt they were being brought into deeper contact with reality through cinema compared to what kind of had been, more common before. But it's interesting. I think looking back on it now and seeing there are these very like kind of manipulative aspects to shaping like the view of the enemy or, of the good guys or whatever that, maybe was not as visible or not, just people weren't as concerned about it. But I think from our point of view today, like if we're trying to get to the same goal of like looking at what is really real about these films and what is so compelling and what can Catholic artists and filmmakers take from these films to apply today, because I think that the aspect of, as a filmmaker, like the aspect of making a film that's quite propagandistic in how it's portraying different sides or whatever, to me, that's a bit of a red flag, in terms of like, how do I want to try to get to the reality of something? We know that life isn't that simple, even in wartime. So I don't know. I'm just kind of throw that out. I'm curious about what you guys think of that aspect.
I think there's a little thing about the way what the story is telling. So the story, it's yes, it's the figure of the priest is based on Don Morosini, but it's also apparently also based on Don Pietro Pappagallo, who was killed in the Fosse Ardeatine. And the Fosse Ardeatine is a real thing that happens to the Romans under the occupation of the Nazis, in which these partigiani, these people attempting to combat the Germans, they blow up a German space and they kill a few Germans. And the Germans exact 10 Italian lives for each life lost. And they're taken out. And when they're being driven out, that moment when the truck is driving out outside the city, it looks a lot like the Fosse. Like the first thing that came to my mind is, Fosse Ardeatine. This is the moment where there's going to be this massive murder of the Italians in the tenfold murder of the Italians for the death of the Germans. And so that is a moment of the outrage of the Nazi occupation. It's a moment of, a reminder of what happens when the Italians try to fight back. That's a story that we're like, it's very imbued in our culture here. We've got the Fosse Ardeatine here. We talk about it. It's a real memory here. And I think that plays into the Italians, who really do have to change their narrative. I mean, they do. They have to change it. And history written by the victors, whatever. But the fact is, the Italians started this war on the wrong side, allied with the worst person in the world, led by the second worst person in the world. And now they are sitting here begging the English and the Americans to give their lives to free them. And so some imagery of how they tried to is important. And it is a really good example of how art can be used to create a kind of diplomacy. Because at the end of the day, that priest who is praying under his breath, the forgiveness, they know not what they do, that's the only way that the wounds of this war are going to be healed. So it is a propaganda in part. Oh, yes. And we have to overlook some stuff on the part of the Italians. But it's also a kind of propaganda that there is no going forth from war in this tiny little continent unless we start to think, forgive them, Lord, we know not what they do. And that is the closing moment. And that these children watch him do this. The next generation is watching this particular witness.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because, like you were saying, Liz, about the hand of the artist, this level of artifice, we keep using words like propaganda or manipulative, and those do, perhaps rightly have a negative connotation. But when it comes to the artist, to be able to manipulate one's instrument is actually the thing. And so manipulation in this context is actually a mark of mastery. And propaganda, well, we talk about the propaganda fide, right? Like the propagation of the faith. Like, it's about messaging. And of course, your message can be really bad, and then the propaganda is really bad. But when the message points to a reality that would otherwise get lost, this deeper reality of the need for forgiveness, well, then that's realist in a whole new way, right? It's just true. And so this is a very interesting conversation, and it's a very interesting film to jump from, to have this conversation around.